Hi, my name's Gianna Machera. I am currently a senior right now in high school. I got into the program a year ago when it was in Search of Truth, and I loved it, and I've continued. And this is just an amazing program, and I'm so excited for today.
Hi, I'm Anya. I'm a junior at Scripps College in Claremont. I've been part of the program for a year now, and it's been really great for me. And it's cool to get to talk to all sorts of artists and creatives, but it's especially cool to be here now, especially in person, since most of our interviews are on Zoom.
Hi, everyone. My name is Emma Larson. I'm currently getting a master's in Russian, Eastern European, and Eurasian Studies at Columbia, but I've been involved with the Wende since 2020, and with this program since 2 years ago with In Search of Truth, and it's such a fantastic opportunity to talk about artists and be involved with the LA art scene, so just feeling very, very grateful to be here.
Hi, I'm Zora. I'm a junior at NYU studying music performance and media culture communication. I joined the program about a year ago on a trip here, so I'm the honorary East Coaster, and I'm just so excited to be finally in person with everyone.
Hi guys, I'm Meghana. I'm a second year at the University of Chicago studying public policy and psychology. I joined the program 2 years ago now, which is crazy, and it's been amazing working with everyone, and now we're in person, so I'm excited. I will be moderating the interview with everybody today.
Hi, I'm Yus, and I'm going to be roasted today.
Hi everyone, my name is Amy Cabrales. I am a UCLA senior studying sociology and Russian language. I was an intern at the Wende last fall, so it's been a year, and I joined the program as well because I did not want to leave the Wende, so I figured any way to stay would be good. And it's been a really amazing program, meeting the girls, and just talking with artists all over LA and even internationally.
Hi, my name is Lexi Tooley. I'm a current sophomore at the University of Pennsylvania, and I've also been on the council since In Search of Truth, so for the past 2 years. And I'm just so excited to be here today and talk in person and see everyone and just be here. And yeah.
Hi, everyone. I'm Natalie McDonald. I graduated from Pomona College in Claremont back in 2019, currently pursuing my master's in history at Cal State Northridge. Also second year on the council. So excited to be here in person today and for our conversation.
Good afternoon again, everyone, and thank you for joining us for this very special program in the series, The Political Mandate of the Arts, organized by the Student Council and presented in partnership with the Wende Museum, the Thomas Mann House, and Double Up Radio. We are delighted to welcome everyone to the first in-person program of the series this year. Once again, my name is Zora Nelson, and it's my pleasure and privilege to be a member of the Student Council, a team of high school, undergraduate, and graduate students who, in conversation with visual artists, musicians, dancers, writers, theaters, and filmmakers, cultural critics, curators, and others, explores how the arts can make a difference in times of social and political crises. Segal is the chief curator and director of programming at the Wende Museum of the Cold War, where he has organized more than 25 exhibitions. Prior to his current role at the Wende, he was a professor of cultural history at the University of Utrecht in the Netherlands. He has published widely on German cultural history, Cold War culture, and art and politics in international perspective. Among his book publications are Divided Dream Worlds, The Cultural Cold War in East and West, co-edited with Peter Romajan and Giles Scott Smith, and Art and Politics Between Purity and Propaganda. His book, Art and Politics, particularly relevant to our theme today, explores the roles of artists, critics, historians, politicians, and secret services in the surprising ways that art and politics intertwine. Use's current exhibitions that just opened here at the Wende are Visions of Transcendence, Creating Space in East and West, which highlights the resilience and creative power of people deprived of their freedom or their own place to live, and Chaya Stoica and Seeds of Roma Life, which juxtaposes artwork by Austrian Romani writer, musician, painter, and activist Chaya Stoica, with captivating photographs of Roma and Sinti daily life in Cold War Eastern Europe. We extend our thanks to Susan Horowitz and Rick Feldman for generously supporting online and on-site discussions here at the Wende Museum. We'd like to thank everyone for joining us today. And with that, I'd like to pass things along to Meghana, who will be moderating today's discussion.
Thank you, Zora. Yus, thank you again for joining us today. You have been an amazing mentor and organizer throughout these last 2 years, and I think we've all been so lucky to be able to work with you. On that note, we are so glad that we get to ask you questions about your amazing work today. To start off the conversation, I want to pass it to Gianna, who's going to ask you about your motivation in pursuing the work of art and politics.
Yes, I have like 3 questions pushed into one for our first question about your background and your passions. So why do you do the work that you do, and how did you get into this field? What were your original inspirations for delving into art and politics, and how have these passions shifted or remained the same through your position of Chief Curator and Director of Programming here?
Okay, thank you so much, Gianna, and thank you all of you for inviting me today. It's such an honor to speak with you, and it has been such an incredible pleasure and privilege to work with you over the past 2 years. For some of you, a little bit shorter, but it has been such a lovely and inspiring experience. It's actually one of my favorite projects ever at the Wende Museum. So, thank you for your question, and maybe I should start with the fact that I started studying art history at the University of Amsterdam with the hope of, I had a passion for art with the hope of understanding more about the historical context of art, how it was embedded, and also how art could have meaning in social and political life. And then it occurred to me that in the university program, art was not treated or not approached in that way. It was either approached in a more hermetic way as a kind of stylistic tradition or stylistic development from one style to another without any or hardly any historical context, or it was approached very theoretically, and you read a lot about Foucault but didn't get to know much about the artwork. And then I wondered, what kind of approach do you need in order to really embed art in a historical context? So I looked at history, but then noticed that most historians only use artwork as an illustration for events or processes where art essentially doesn't play any role. So that's actually inspired me to delve a little bit deeper into this connection between art and politics or art and history. And that is also why after I wrote my PhD in art history, I actually changed to the history department and became a history assistant professor. Then nowadays I'm a curator, so that's still another different step. And that is maybe a funny story because it shows how strange life can be. There was an exchange program between my university in the Netherlands, Utrecht University, and UCLA. And one of my students at UCLA mentioned that there was a Wende Museum I had never heard of, brought me there. I met with the founding director, Justin Jempol. We actually immediately became friends. And then a few years later, I got a Fulbright grant to again guest teach at UCLA, but also become a guest curator here. And then still, a few years later, I got this job offer to work here. And after working for about 15 years at the history department in Utrecht in the Netherlands, I decided that it was actually a very attractive next step to work as a curator and be more directly involved in outreach and also be able to be more experimental than is possible at the university. So I think that's it in a nutshell.
Yeah, I think as a curator, you do have now like the responsibility to do a lot of the things that you were looking for as a student, which is you get to embed art in history, which I think this exhibit does a great job of doing. But I think I can speak personally and say that I don't know much about the processes behind being a curator. So my question was, what is the process of designing an exhibition, and how do museums play a role in conveying a certain message when combining many works of art and deciding how to display certain pieces?
Yeah, it's a great question, and actually there's not a single answer to that because different exhibitions have different stories. Sometimes it starts with a concept, an idea you have, and then you start looking for materials around it. And sometimes you start with the material. In the case of our current exhibition, Visions of Transcendence, I was on a trip in Toronto at another collection, saw these amazing enamels by a Soviet sculptor, Leonid Nedov, which he made in a gulag in prison. And then I started to think how to expand on this topic and make an exhibition about incarcerated art. And then from one step, it leads to the next step. So first I thought about the contextualization of Soviet bloc and East European incarcerated artists. Then I realized that you can't put together an exhibition in the United States with such a high percentage of incarcerated people without referencing the here and now, which, by the way, is something we always do at the Wende Museum. There's always a connection with the present. And I think that works quite well because of the juxtaposition. So it's not just Soviet bloc, it's not just here and now, but it is a confrontation. And that inspires, I think, you to look for similarities and differences and, yeah, get a little bit deeper into the issues and stories, very important stories behind these artworks.
Yeah, definitely. I think your answer did a great job in transitioning to the next question. I think you kind of touched on it within your answer, but I'm going to pass it to Anya, who has a question on like the combination of historical and contemporary work, which is exactly what you do at this exhibition.
Yes, it was a very good transition, but I remember when I first came to the Wende, I was really struck by that way that the contemporary and the historical art is always placed together. So I was just curious about what your process is in kind of finding those works and putting them together in conversation, how you interpret them maybe differently or together, and then why you think it's important to put those in conversation. And I'm wondering maybe you have an example from the exhibition that you can talk about here.
Yeah, thank you. I love this question. The point is, I think, although I know that some historians and some curators won't agree with that history is not something you can just present and then you learn about it and that's it. Facts don't speak for themselves. They always need an interpretation, a perspective, a background story. And yeah, I try to be as conscious as possible about it. We look at the past from a certain standpoint, from a certain perspective, even if only because we have nowadays certain concerns and hopes and interests that are very different from the past. So you always have to make this translation from the past to the present and vice versa, from the present to the past. And at the Wende Museum, we have mostly thematic, or actually always thematic exhibitions. So it starts with the concept, and then I look for, or our team, looks for artists who work with comparable ideas, comparable concepts. And I never look for a one-on-one fit. I think it's very interesting and rewarding to find artwork that slightly contradicts your concept or forces you to think out of the box of the concept. So it's not just trying to match past and present, but trying to find creative tensions between them.
And I think this shows up in like the way that you display the exhibitions too. A lot of the processes in curating an exhibition are similar to what artists do themselves, in that you're trying to decide how to present a certain message or interpretation. And Lexi had a great question that builds on this concept of utilizing similar skills and displaying artwork as artists do in creating the artwork itself.
Thank you. Sorry. In the TEDx Fulbright talk, you discussed how modern artists sometimes felt the need to express their own perspectives on the world, and through their work, sometimes utilizing strategies of illusion, combination, juxtaposition, and more. And I was wondering, as the chief curator and director of programming here at the Wende, do you ever utilize strategies such as those to curate these exhibitions that reflect and explore evolving intentions and topics in contemporary and historical art?
Yeah, thank you for that question, because I've never so explicitly thought about it as you formulated now, but I think it's very true. And let me mention two examples. One is juxtaposition. So artists sometimes convey messages by combining other aspects of visual culture that work together in a very productive way. And I think that's something I also try to do. For instance, in the current exhibition, Visions of Transcendence, we have one part of Soviet bloc artists and another part of contemporary Western artists. And that juxtaposition is curated in a way that you are invited to see parallels and ask yourself about commonalities. I think another strategy that is used by artists and that I'm using also as a curator is contradiction. And it's maybe good to mention that this is also one of the reasons why I very much enjoyed moving from history to a curator position. Among historians, it's very common to discuss everything. Art historians as well. Nothing is given, everything is interpreted, and everything is a continuous discussion about how to make sense of things. Whereas my impression of most exhibitions was that you enter, you get the narrative, the vision of the curator, and then it's take it or leave it. And I think it's very important to have that openness of mind as a curator and show the different perspectives. And I actually did one exhibition called Questionable History, where I made that a very explicit point. So one section of that exhibition contained artwork with not one but two different text labels that were both historically true and historically accurate, but completely contradicted each other in terms of interpretation. And I think that's how it works. It's never given how you interpret a work or a piece of history. You have to think about it. I also want to say that I definitely don't think that any interpretation is possible. It's not just that there are established facts, but it's also that there are interpretations that are clearly more convincing and more trustworthy than others. Although it's very hard to define that in a very precise way. But I think it's important to keep that in mind, because that is also what allows us to stay in conversation. If you don't accept each other's truth, historically or otherwise, you lose the common playing field, and eventually you get a situation where we are now in part, where some people present facts and others say, I don't care about facts, I present alternative facts. So yeah, it's a tricky situation, but I still think it's important not to suggest that there is one truth and you don't have to think about it.
Yeah, that definitely touches on our program from 2021, In Search of Truth. And on that note, I think what gives art a lot of its power is that there are many interpretations, and that some may say that makes the art controversial. So on that note, I'm going to pass it to Zora, who had a question about the political power of the creation of art and your TED Talk.
Thank you. Yes, to touch on your TEDx Fulbright talk once again, the politics of images. It sent me into a spiral of thoughts on the relationship between the artist, the audience, and the tool used for a piece's very creation. And with that, I wanted to ask, would you say that there is an inherent, controversial power in the creation of art itself? As in, when is the exact moment that a piece may become political, if not as soon as the pen hits the paper?
Yeah, can I ask you, what do you mean by immediately controversial? Because I didn't quite get that.
I remember after watching your TED Talk, you said that in a way, even if the intention behind the piece isn't for a political message, that piece just is political, like the art piece. And I guess I was thinking, would you say just in the process of even creating art, whether it be visual art or poetry or a dance per se, do you see would you say in that process there is some sort of power in that?
Yeah, I definitely think so. I also think that the story is a bit different for different artistic media. For instance, if you speak about literature or film, that has much more of a direct narrative structure which you can relate to. Music is very abstract, for instance, and you can, given the context, give it a political interpretation maybe, but it's much less direct and much more abstract. I think visual art is somewhere in the middle there, so it invites a lot of political interpretations or readings, but it's also open to other approaches. And to your question, when is the moment that art becomes political? I think there is not one particular moment, but there are different phases when art can be political. And in my book on art and politics, I actually little bit schematically distinguish between 4 levels. So there's the idea of artistic intention. What does the artist actually want to express? There is the idea of reception. How do art critics and the general public respond to art? There's the level of historical or art historical contextualization. So how is the artwork being positioned in a larger story of historical development? And finally, there's the very base level of political use or abuse of art by states, by politicians, by secret services, etc. The interesting thing is that those levels can completely contradict each other. And in my book, I think I give one funny example of the artist Barnett Newman, abstract expressionist American artist, who once in an interview said, those who really understand my art read it as the end of both state capitalism and totalitarianism. It was in the early Cold War years, so it's a clear dismissal of both American and Soviet political systems, and of course of National Socialism as well. But what happened next was that the State Department in the United States used works by Barnett Newman and other abstract painters for traveling exhibitions to Europe to prove the open and democratic character of Western capitalist society. So it became a political symbol in support of state capitalism, while at the same time conservative politicians and the FBI dismissed this artwork as part of a communist conspiracy to subvert American society. So I think the irony here is endless, actually.
Yeah, I think I really loved your answer on like expression versus reception versus contextualization versus political abuse, like those levels. I think these next 3 or 4 questions are going to explore those, so let's see if we can get deeper on those. So building on Zora's question, there is a distance between when the pencil hits the paper and when the artwork is on display for individuals to see. Emma had a question that touches on the relationship between an artist's political messaging within their art and individual interpretations.
Yeah, I think that while Zora's question is, the art and creation, this question is more about maybe levels 3 and 4 of the reception of art and how it can be manipulated. But I think often when we talk about the political meaning of art, we're somehow assuming that it's imbued with a political meaning, like this is what the State Department is doing with this abstract expressionist work. And I'm curious how, in your mind, that intersects with people's subjective feeling, emotion of seeing a piece of art? And is there a contradiction between imbuing art with a larger meaning and then someone's individual relationship with a work?
Yeah, that's a beautiful question. And actually, I already mentioned that these 4 levels are schematic, if only because, first of all, there are many different reviewers who can have very different ideas. Art can be contextualized in 1,000 ways, etc. And even what seems to be very straightforward, the intention of the artist is far from straightforward, because there are so many examples of artists changing their meaning or changing their own contextualization. To give one very crude example, the German expressionist painter Emil Nolde, during the Third Reich, tried to sell his work as being the embodiment of the ideology of National Socialism. Then Germany lost the war. His works had been a part of this exhibition, Degenerate Art, where they were shown in a very dismissive way. So after the war, he made the point that he was the victim of National Socialism and a kind of artist hero who opposed the regime. So, yeah, everything is in flux, I would say, where it comes to the political interpretation of artwork. But to your point, I think the personal level is important because sometimes we might think that we are talking about the same thing, and we are not. For instance, I can explain to you how I read or how I interpret a painting, and you can say, oh, I completely agree, and think something completely different because the words I use have a different meaning for you. So I think there is not one strict political meaning or meaning whatsoever you can refer to. It's always this personal interpretation of the meaning. Yeah.
And I'm going to move right away to Amy's question because it builds on this, particularly in terms of like the shock value within that like an artist has in their artwork.
Yeah, so in your work, you've talked about how images have the ability to shock their viewers. So I wanted to ask about for this exhibition personally, do you think the artists and image makers in this exhibit created their art, with the intention of having a shocking effect on its viewers, specifically because when I came and I saw it, I was just taken aback by how deep and real these artworks are. And I thought about, prison reform and total institutions and how they work. And so I'm wondering, do you think this was part of the artist's goal apart from just sharing their natural experiences here?
Yeah, also great question. And the honest answer is that in many cases I don't know. Yeah. And the reason is that some of these stories are shocking not because the artists want them to be shocking, but because they are. Yeah. And they're just relaying their own experiences. Yeah. I mean, speaking about prison reform or the justice in prisons, one of the artists who very explicitly refers to it is Obi Weathers, who is now on death row in Texas. And he makes the point that there's a kind of discrepancy in the fact that on the one hand, he has been in jail for about 20 years. The state invests so much money to keep him in solitary confinement. Also gives him the opportunity, since a certain point, to educate himself. And he's actually now teaching through his cell with an iPad at the University of Santa Barbara. But at the same time, he is on death row and can be killed any moment. So those weird situations are part of the story of this exhibition. But they are reality. And I think it is, in this case, the reality that is shocking, not so much the particular intention of the artist.
Amy, do you feel like your follow-up question like feeds into this? Can I give you the chance to do that?
Yeah, of course. So I guess since we're talking about shock already, do you think that the shock factor of images or of monuments even, are they necessary to ignite mobilization or social movements or social change? Because I know sometimes art is a really great way to keep mobilization, up and running, especially about prison reform. So do you think it's necessary or just rather a helpful catalyst to mobilize people in the same way that, social media might be a catalyst?
Yeah, maybe more the latter. I mean, shock value can be very effective. And also thinking of a famous 19th century example of Edouard Manet and his painting Olympia, which is derived from a Renaissance example, the Venus of Urbino by Titian. But he changed a few things, and all of a sudden this naked goddess turns into a prostitute in the middle of the painting that stares at you directly. It's very confrontational, and by creating this shock effect, it's very effective. But I don't think that's the only strategy, and I also think that sometimes it's not even quite clear in what context an image or an artwork can have this powerful shock effect. I'm thinking now of another artist we had in our exhibition about flags and banners, Rufina Baslova, who lives in exile in Prague, but she's from Belarus. And her images that are stylistically based on folk art in Belarus, textile folk art, but very powerfully illustrate scenes of demonstrations against Lukashenko's dictatorial regime, have become a very powerful symbol of the pro-democracy movement in Belarus. And I'm not sure if she initially realized this was that her work would have such a powerful role in this pro-democracy movement.
And I think like the shock effect you were talking about, it can be felt and very like confrontational with a lot of the contemporary pieces, because this is an issue that's happening right now. But I think you can go further to say like that same shock value can be felt with historical pieces, even though there is this distance. But also like social movements change, so the way that we interpret art can change as well. So I'm going to pass it to Natalie to expand a little bit more on this.
Yeah, thank you, Meghana. Yeah, so building upon this idea of how the political meaning of art is always in flux, I'm interested in the way that works of public art specifically are reinterpreted years or decades after their initial creation. So on the one hand, we have the statue of Confederate General Robert E. Lee in Charlottesville, Virginia, that was melted down just a couple of weeks ago to create new, more inclusive public art. On the other hand, we have David Alfaro Siqueiros' Olvera Street mural, America Tropical, which was whitewashed within a couple years of its 1932 completion due to its quote-unquote communist content, but then conserved by the Getty between 1988 and 2012. So I'm curious, Yus, what you think about these kind of second moments of meaning-making. Are there other examples of reinterpretation that you found inspiring and or concerning? And might the Wende Museum itself even perhaps be one example?
That's a fun thought, yeah. Well, first of all, and thank you for this. First of all, in my book on art and politics, I spent the last chapter about the fate of communist monuments after the end of state socialism. And so many Lenin and Karl Marx monuments have been removed, but it's very interesting to see what came in their place. It's also interesting to note, by the way, that monuments they're everywhere and they are monumental, but no one sees them, because who cares? Until the moment that they become politically poisonous and people start to speak about them and then start to deface them or remove them or whatever they do. I think it's quite interesting to follow those stories. Also, by the way, the stories of street names. Street names sometimes, as far as they relate to historical figures and events, actually are a very interesting source for reconstructing the canon of society, how a society wants to see itself. So you see at every more radical regime change, political change, that people start to rename their streets, which also happened after the end of state socialism. So yeah, there are many interesting examples, and I think it's very productive to think about that. As to your question about whether the Wende Museum is also an example, I think yes, in a certain sense. Also, we actually did an exhibition about this phenomenon. It was called Transformations, and we have a lot of pieces of material culture from everyday life from the communist countries. And we put in this exhibition the very same objects or very similar objects in 4 different contexts. The first was an apartment with a living room with a garden. The second was a flea market. The third was a museum, and the last was an art studio. And the idea was to show that the same object can have radically different meanings in different contexts. So it starts as an object of daily use, then in the flea market, which reflected the period of the end of state socialism when people were just throwing away their stuff. It is considered to be worthless junk. Then at a certain point, some of these materials were rediscovered for their aesthetic quality or historical significance and put in a museum context. And then finally, we invited 6 or 7 contemporary artists to use these same objects as a source of inspiration to reflect on the here and now. So, yeah, I think that is an example where the Wende Museum becomes also an example of these changing meanings. Also, of course, because the fact that we have here Cold War materials from the socialist countries implies that all these materials are completely decontextualized. We show them here under the palm tree, so to speak. I think that can be interesting, and exactly the historical distance and the geographical distance inspires certain questions that would not come up so easily when you would exhibit these things in the countries themselves.
You said in your answer that different artwork has different meanings in different contexts, which means like a lot of people can give art different meanings. I think Emma had a good question about this.
Yeah, well, and just to speak on the Wende being such a special place because it does decontextualize things. Like I remember when I first got involved with the Wende, I had just come back from living in Russia and seeing the art here and being involved with it in Southern California put on a totally different spin. So just appreciative of all the great work that the Wende does. But my question is about the political contexts of art and the different meanings that it can have. It's very clear that it's not just one meaning. The artist gives it a meaning, the viewer gives it a meaning, capitalism can give it a meaning. Whose meaning do you think is the most right or productive or valuable? Can you even make that claim? If you're trying to look at an art and really get to the core of it, what approach is the most effective for arriving there in your mind?
I don't know. It depends, I think, on what you want to do. So, speaking for myself, with different exhibitions, I can follow different aims, and that then informs how I contextualize artworks, how I use them. Always, of course, in conversation with the artist. I mean, it's a dialogue. It's not that I come up with something and then we do it my way. But it is something that develops through conversation and through discussion. But your question, is there a most important interpretation of art? I don't see that. I don't know. Do you think so?
I think that I tend to look at art through a historical, political perspective. So I would say the truest interpretation is the one that is societally agreed upon. It's the meaning that art holds in a public space. But that does not diminish people's individual relationships. But I think we can learn the most if we think about art on that societal level. But that's my personal answer, and I'm sure that all of us would give a very different one.
And then I have another question for you, because that's an abstraction, and if you look into more detail, you see that on that societal level, people completely contradict each other.
Yeah, I think the interpretation that I would be the most wary of is the one being imposed from above. And if there's a bunch of individual interpretations, the answer is that everyone's bringing their own to it. But I still think we can learn the most by the way that it's being used from above, that it's being pushing forward goals societally. But that's the beautiful thing about art. Everyone can have their own interpretation, and that's why it's something we continue to talk about. Right? I think this microphone died. But
That's a really interesting question. I'm starting to think about it too. Because for me, I would assume the people around me are correct, the people that I agree with on everything else, but that could be kind of wrong too. It goes back to In Search of Truth again with individual interpretations, but I feel I've met some people where I'm you're definitely wrong, but that might be problematic. So already, our conversation has demonstrated the inherent power of artwork in transforming beliefs and outlooks, if you're open to it, obviously. So going further, I'm going to pass it to Zora to ask about the weaponization of art specifically.
Thank you. Yes, after listening to your interview with KCRW, it led me to think about the concept of art as a weapon. And I wanted to know your thoughts on weaponizing art, not only from the perspective of the artists themselves, but also the perspective of those who consume it, especially in a political context. And with that, do you think the potential for weaponization on the consumer's end then takes away the artist's agency?
Yeah, that's an interesting point. So first of all, I think that not all art lends itself easily to weaponization or to different interpretations. To give one example, if you think of the photomontage by John Hartfield, where he criticizes the Third Reich, I mean, you can be very creative in your interpretation, but no one in his right mind would say that it's possible to interpret it as a defense of National Socialism, those works. Whereas if you look at an abstract painting like those of Barnett Newman, then it shows that you can interpret it in many different ways. But yeah, the question you pose, is there something in the interpretation of the reception that actually diminishes the agency of the artist? I'm not so sure, because first of all, you can argue that at least the artwork is talked about, so it's part of the discussion, and as it is part of the discussion, many different parts of the discussion can be effective. But also the artists themselves can be part of this discussion and write about it, giving interviews about it, so they can actually reclaim their agency, I think. And, unless, of course, you live in a totalitarian regime and there is censorship and you are not free to express yourself.
I think reclaiming your agency, a lot of people do that when they use the strategy that you talked about in your TED Talk with appropriation, where they take something that's been widely circulated and they kind of make it their own. I feel like that's some sort of agency in some way. Maybe I'm hugely reaching with that, but I wanted to pass it to Amy to kind of ask a question regarding this.
Yeah, so in your TED Talk, you mentioned how there are strategies that artists use, one being appropriation. And I wanted to ask, do you think there's pros and cons to the strategy? Because they'll relate their own images to pictorial traditions that have become part of our collective memory. So I think a con could be that it'll hinder us from further creativity, creating new strategies, but at the same time, because they're familiar and they're in our memories, we can relate to them in an easier level. So do you think there's any other pros and cons to having the appropriation strategy as an artist?
Yeah, you know, I think it's one of many possible strategies. Yeah, pros and cons, I don't know. It really depends on the context, I think. I would also argue that to a certain extent, artists are always appropriating existing visual culture, because if that were not the case, you wouldn't understand anything of it. There always needs to be some reference, some shared playing field, I think. And yeah, that actually brings me to another thought, and we already touched upon it a little bit, and that has to do with the first season of the Student Council, In Search of Truth. I think this concept of a shared playing field is actually more important than many people realize, and especially now, because if you lose that sense of conversation and being on the same level, then eventually you lose the rule of law, I think. Everything becomes relative. Alternative facts become as important as real facts. And that is the first step towards totalitarianism and a rule based on made-up facts. So this is a little jump from your question about appropriation, but I'm thinking of it because it has something to do with being in constant conversation and discussion with each other.
On the note of constant conversation, I think a museum is like an amazing place for that to happen. It encourages this sense of conversation. And as a museum curator, you're responsible for creating this public space that reaches a relatively broad audience. Anya had a great question about some potential challenges that may come with displaying artwork for a generally wide viewership.
Yeah, I think that your last answer really reflects the question that I was going to ask about, that the museum on its own and the art that's here exists on its own, but that it's also like people are coming and going from their own perspectives, from their own worlds, and that this is still participating, like obviously in Culver City and LA and in the world. So I was just curious about the ethical and political concerns that you encounter in your work, doing this kind of historical reinterpretation, maybe to reference Natalie's question, for a generally public audience especially. How do you approach these concerns, and maybe if you have any examples, either from this exhibition or from others that you could talk about to kind of give texture to your answer?
Yeah, sure. So first of all, I think, we are talking about the politics of curating, but I think it's not the task of a museum to make political statements. It's the task of a museum to open up discussion and allow for perspectives that allow for conversation and a possible deeper insight into the political questions. They can have a very direct political relevance, of course, but it's a different level. Culture is a slightly different level than party politics. Speaking about ethical questions, we always encounter them. And one of them has to do with representation. So, for instance, in both our current exhibitions, Visions of Transcendence and Chaya Stoica and Scenes of Roma Life, we asked ourselves the question, who are we to represent works by people in a situation, for instance, in prison or being unhoused, that is not our situation, or artworks from a community we don't belong to ourselves. So I think there are a few strategies to work with that. In our Chaya Stoica exhibition, we worked extensively with the Chaya Stoica International Association, people who are very familiar with the works in the community and very supportively helped us with how to contextualize and make sense of these works. And the same is true for the incarcerated and unhoused artists. We actually went one step further there and realized that in order to give these people a voice, we should ask them, invite them to write their own exhibition labels in the first person, because then you really get their perspective. And I think that is a way of dealing with this ethical question, not overstepping your own limits and being respectful towards the people whose work you represent or display.
Yeah, and I think it opens up like these collaborative interpretations that are kind of exemplify what you're talking about. I think about opening the conversation, but it starts from like the first interpretation itself.
Okay, I'm actually going to move to Natalie's question next because I think it connects well to this. Because you talked about like the museum and what you guys have done specifically to display art and like maintain the artist's voice. So I'm going to pass it to Natalie to ask a question about the responsibilities of the curator in impacting art and politics.
Yeah, so you, in a recent interview, you said that a key question you ask yourself when it comes to museum acquisitions is, does it have the power to reinterpret parts of history? So where do the methods and responsibilities of a curator and historian converge or diverge? Do you consider yourself to have a political mandate as a curator? And what about as a historian?
Yeah, thank you for that. Political mandate, yes, but again, maybe in an indirect way, not in the sense of making political statements, but in the sense of trying to meaningfully contextualize the political discussions and offering a basis for conversation. Sorry, what was the other part of your question?
Yes, so where do the methods and responsibilities of a curator and a historian converge or diverge?
Right. I think they're exactly the same. It's only that historians and curators don't always acknowledge that. But I think what is sometimes missing among historians is not so much the discussion, there's a lot of high quality discussion, but the ability to convey those discussions in ways that they become meaningful for a wider public and also become effective as part of the broader social conversation. Whereas in terms of curators, there are a lot of exhibitions that have a large appeal, but tell a very simple and straightforward story where I think you could have done better. And actually look at the historians and their way of being open for different interpretations, being open for the ambiguities of history. So I see it as my task as a curator not to directly educate people, but to confuse them, I would say. But confuse them in a creative way, so that they're inspired to think a little bit more and maybe ask themselves questions they haven't asked themselves before.
I love that, the idea of confusing people in creative ways. Maybe we all need to be more confused more often. In risk of sounding like a broken record, I am going to finish our final question with another kind of reference to In Search of Truth, and the idea of challenging our own instinctual interpretations or opinions, and thus opening ourselves up to the complexities of what we are viewing. So I'm going to pass it to Gianna to ask the final question of our interview portion.
Yes, I was wanting to inquire a little more about like your mindset and your process. You've already answered part of this with Anya and Natalie's question, but your TEDx Fulbright presentation left the audience with a powerful message about the complexities of art and history. You urge your audience to refrain from thinking in black and white or right and wrong, when history is often much richer and more colorful than it might seem to the eye. As a historian, how do you constantly push yourself to explore this point of view, and what is your process when looking at history through this lens, both as a historian and as a curator?
Yeah, thank you. It's a great question. And I mean, in part, it has to do with intuition, I think, but also with what I try to do, always be critical and self-critical. So if you look at your own opinions, there are so many where you can ask, what is the basis for it? And is it an opinion or is it just a matter of bias? And I think the method of looking into that is to look for contradictory opinions and contradictory messages. It's also a strategy or a trick, if you will, that I use a lot in the exhibitions. There are always tensions in the exhibitions at the Wende Museum, things that contradict each other, things that seem to be on very different pages. But I think it's a method that helps you. It helps you realize the complexity and the ambiguity of things. So, sorry, can you once more repeat your question?
You kind of already answered it, but I was kind of just wanting to know, like, do you have like a process? Like, how do you go through this? Do you have like a process in your mind, or do you just take it like step by step with experience? That was more or less my question.
Yeah, okay, yeah. No, yeah, I think I did answer it, indeed. Thank you. Yeah.
Should we move on to the Q&A? Yeah. Yeah, no, I think that was your answer about the role of a museum is not to have a political message, but is to create space to have conversations, to have other people create their own political messages. Is like a part of your own process, right? You're in doing that and creating that space, you are forced to interrogate your own political beliefs, and like that's the whole thing. But that was a lot of questions from us, and so we would love to have the audience ask you some questions. So if anyone has a thought, a question either for use or at risk of, hopefully this is okay, for any of the council members, if you have a question for us, I think that could also be interesting. Yeah, just raise your hand and someone will bring you a microphone.
Hi, thank you, everybody. I'm curious how your work with the council over these last 2 years has informed or challenged your work as a curator, and how working with this group has impacted what you do.
That's a fantastic question. I think I learned so much from working with you guys. And yeah, Megan, you mentioned that Gina and I were good mentors for you, but you have been such excellent mentors for me. I learned so much from your questions, from your critical attitudes. I think I've grown as a curator by following and supporting this student council group. There are so many also aspects that came up during the many interviews that made me think. And I think all those experiences, I can't say very literally this work hangs there because of the interview or because of Anja's question for this or that person, but it is more a general impression that, yeah, you taught me how to think a little bit deeper, and I really appreciate it.
Any other questions from the audience?
Well, then I just want to thank you for everything that you're doing here. This is one of the only places that glows with hope that I come to. Everything I come to here, I leave feeling nourished. So that's it. I just want to say thank you.
Well, thank you so much. Yeah. And I think that's another, by the way, we didn't address that, that's another assignment for museums and other cultural institutions, creating hope. That's so important, and especially now.
Hello, I have a question. When creating a space for dialogues that sometimes conflict, how do you mitigate hurt feelings, for lack of a better word, or how do you mitigate how extreme emotions arise and people feeling either left out, victimized, or blamed? If you have anything to speak about, like creating an environment that is healthy and safe conversations rather than conflict.
Yeah, we try to be as open-minded and conscious about it as possible. It's not always possible, of course, but I think our current exhibition, Visions of Transition, again, is a good example there, where we represent people in such dire circumstances and sometimes quite hopeless situations. But I think what is so beautiful about this exhibition is that it also shows our shared humanity. What struck me while working on this exhibition is that, and I mentioned that before, but it's really true, that for many of these artists, art is a matter of life and death, in a very literal way. If they wouldn't have the opportunity to express themselves in this way, they would not survive. That's what they say, and that's what you feel when you speak with them, that's what you see when you look at their artwork. So it's very much about creating this space to reach out, to realize that we are all part of the same human race, so to speak.
That's, I think, a beautiful place to end, unless one last opportunity for questions. No? Okay. Thank you all so much for being here. We are only able to do this work because the Wende has such incredible visitors and sponsors and people that do believe in the mission of art and community and coming together in looking for hope. Yes, so this is the Wende Student Council. We have our final meeting of the year in December on Zoom, which you will be able to find more information on the Wende's website and different social medias. But again, thank you so much, and we hope you enjoyed today's conversation.